It is a really dangerous threat in many ways, and in particular the way Reform basically wants to take a whole load of people who have lived in Britain for years, contributed to Britain, and kick them out of the country because they don't like them. In lots of places, the local electoral battleground is becoming Lib Dem versus Reform.
Hi, I'm Harry Adams, and apart from being mildly sunburnt, I present the Beacon podcast, where we discuss the rise of populism and the threat it poses to our democracy. Kier Starmer's leadership has taken a lot of fire in the last fortnight, with a leadership challenge expected. Andy Burnham, Wes Streeting, Angela Rayner and others all seem to be waiting in the wings to put forward their case to be the next Prime Minister and Labour leader, although in Burnham's case, he has the tricky test of the Makefield by-election to pass first. But another thing the recent local elections showed us, apart from how strongly disliked this current Labour government is, was just how the traditional two-party system seems to be fractured and doesn't look like mending anytime soon. Reform, the Greens and the Liberal Democrats all made gains, while Labour made huge losses and the Tories lost seats again. In our latest interview, I spoke to Mark Pack, the Liberal Democrat Lords Spokesperson for the Cabinet Office and former President of the Lib Dems between 2020 and 2025. We spoke about how the Lib Dems break through in this attention economy, what role they play in stopping reform, what potential separation from the two-party system means for them, and what he thinks the Labour leadership race means for the country. Hi Mark, thanks for joining us. Can you give us a brief introduction to yourself and your political career?
Yeah, sure, Harry. I was, for 6 years until the beginning of this year, the president of the Liberal Democrats, which is a voluntary post, a little bit like, I guess, if listeners are maybe used to school governors or charities, being like the chair of the board or the chair of the school governors. So not the party leader, but hopefully quite an important role that can bring benefits to the organisation. And then I've also now just completed my first year as a member of the House of Lords, which is a whole other discussion we could doubtless have. It's a very interesting, let's say, institution.
How do you think the Lib Dems have changed over the course of your career? How have you seen the political party sort of shift and mould to the political climate of the day? And where do you think they sit now in that political spectrum?
Yeah, so I joined the party in 1990. So I've seen quite a long period of evolution. And I think the thing that most strikes me is that what people tend to underestimate is the impact of which party is in government. Because if you're an opposition party, which my party has been for nearly all of the time I've been a member of it, if you're an opposition party, just naturally your interests, the media's interests, the voters' interests are overwhelmingly in how do you disagree with the government, would you do differently? There's much less interest in how do you differ from a rival opposition party. And so I think sometimes people talk about, has the party moved to the right or has the party moved to the left? Miss that bigger picture of, if you're an opposition party, the thing you mainly talk about is how are you different from which party's in government. So I think the last couple of years with now a Labour government in Westminster has been quite different, for the Liberal Democrats, because we've been talking more about how we differ from Labour, how we're disappointed in the government not having done a better job and been more ambitious. Whilst prior to that, we were talking much more about the Tories. But that's not a shift of our politics or our values. It's just a shift of the basic landscape in which we're operating.
It's quite interesting there, what you're saying about being an opposition. Do you think that's been one of Labour's downfalls, is they spent so long as the opposition, and it's arguably easier, right, to oppose than it is to, it's easier to oppose another party's politics than it is to say. I mean, I think Labour's been quite poor at setting out its stall under Kier Starmer.
I think, I think Labour basically win about 1 in 3 general elections in the sort of modern democratic era. And in a way, that's quite a dangerous proportion, because it's just enough to make you think, we can win the next election, to think that you're competing on an even playing field with the Conservatives, when actually if they had won a slight smaller proportion of elections, I think when they got into power, they would be have been keener to change the system. Let's pick Ed Miliband, because at the time at which we're recording, there's some speculation he might run for leader. So who knows? Some people may be listening to this in a world in which Ed Miliband is Prime Minister. So let's take him as an example. When he was leader of the opposition in 2010 to 15, decided, and leader of an opposition, you decide to oppose the government, fair enough. But he decided that opposing the government was more important than trying to secure electoral reform for the House of Commons or democracy for the House of Lords. Yeah, he thought, okay, I'll find things to complain about what the government's doing rather than really support the efforts to get those two bits of reform through. And I think that in part is because the culture in Labour is they think of themselves as a party that is almost on a level playing field with the Tories, and that they'll be in power sometimes, the Tories will be in power sometimes, and they're always thinking about what's it going to be like when we're next in power, as opposed to thinking about this is a system that fundamentally we lose 2 times in 3. We really need to change the system whenever we've got any chance to. So I think that is definitely a risk for them. The thing that has, though, surprised me about this Labour government is that my perception of Labour has been that Labour sort of attracts a lot of people who are interested in policy. And there's a big ecosystem of pamphlets and think tanks and podcasts and so on. And yet when it's come to it, I mean, with the exception of some ministers, overall Labour seems to have been really underprepared, really not thought through what its policy platform will be, how it's going to deliver it. And that's certainly not what I was expecting.
What were you expecting?
I was expecting a government that had thought through what its priorities were, that would be very clear at delivering what, to my mind, would be probably a relatively modest programme of change, given where Kier Starmer had positioned himself and the Labour Party, but that he would be really ruthless in pushing through the change that he wanted to see happen. And the debates would be about, why is he not doing more? But that there would be a core agenda that would be, ruthlessly pushed through, and that ruthlessness would be infused all the way through the party, because, massive control, central control over who was selected as Labour MPs. So the Labour Parliamentary Party, hugely made in Starmer's image. And instead, we have a Prime Minister currently, perhaps I should add, who it's almost like he fundamentally doesn't believe in having a strategy. And maybe this comes back to his days as a lawyer, where, you sort of treat each case on its own merits, and therefore you think of each case as an individual. But if you are the head of a large, complicated, multifaceted organisation, nearly everything that nearly everyone does never gets anywhere near your to-do list or your agenda. And so people have to know, what's the overall plan? What's the overall direction? Because otherwise everyone goes off and does their own things, and sometimes that's contradictory, and you end up being much less than the sum of your parts. So yeah, it's a real curio, but it's a curio that it seems like at the moment is coming, that time is coming to an end.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say it now as like a disclaimer. We're recording this on the 18th of May, because you're right. I mean, whether or not he's in power still in a week's time.
Kier Starmer is currently Prime Minister. Andy Burnham is currently not an MP. Yeah. Who knows how much of that will be true in the near future?
So that was sort of brings us quite nicely into my next question. Is like the local election results. What did you make of those? Were you surprised? It kind of feels like that was inevitable. It felt like Labour were going to get a bit of a beating. What do you make?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall the results was pretty much what I expected would happen. I think it was very clear that both Tories and Labour would, suffer really badly, and that my own party, the Lib Dems, as well as Reform and the Greens, we would all be making gains. So that basic landscape, not a surprise. I think what has surprised me is how chilled Conservatives seem to be about their result. Obviously, most attention on the government's result and Labour's result and Reform, but the Tories lost huge numbers of council seats for the second year in a row, and that's not normally what happens to a party that was in government that loses a general election. You normally see them starting to recover quite quickly in local elections, and if anything, the problem normally is that they get too excited about how much they're recovering in local elections and think there's an easier road back for them than there actually is. So the thing that has surprised me is, the Conservatives, losing seats hand over fist to the Lib Dems in places like Surrey, to Reform in other parts of the country. I'm really surprised that there isn't more of a sense in the Conservatives of, we've been completely mullered 2 years in a row. Where the heck should we go next?
Do you think that is a hangover of just how unpopular the last Tory government was, or do you think it's been a lack of activity from Kemi Badenoch and the current batch of Tories, or do you just think it's people are hesitant and less supportive of Labour and Conservative and the traditional two-party system?
I think it's certainly not the first of those, because when we've seen, after the Tories lost in a huge landslide in 1997, they very quickly started making local government gains in the next parliament. Yeah, and we've seen that with other governments that have been voted out of office. The fact that they lost so heavily what is now approaching 2 years ago isn't an excuse. That's not the normal pattern. I think part of it, oddly, is that the Conservative leadership just doesn't really seem to care. So, again, one of the things you normally see with leaders of any party after they've had a really big election setback is you talk about the need to rebuild the party machine, to strengthen the grassroots, to start growing again at the local level, all of that sort of stuff. And that just doesn't really feature in Kemi Badenoch's public utterances. And so I think it would be a real surprise if in private she was really focusing on those sorts of things, given how little. And, one of her sort of strangest comments, I think, as leader was her sort of she thought of it as slightly disdainful, but I thought Lib Dems thought of it as a lovely compliment when she talked about the Lib Dems are the sort of people who worry about fixing church roofs. You think, actually, there's a fundamental misunderstanding there of what the local grassroots of politics is like, which absolutely is about people who are committed to being stuck into their community and getting things fixed, restored, preserved, trying to improve things in the area where they live. And so I think there is just a failure to see the importance of the extent to which the wipeout of the Conservative organisational base is going to cost them dear in the future.
I mean, to add to your point there, I mean, that's kind of an ironic point, yeah, exactly, to make, because that's kind of the ticket that Andy Burnham's running on, having enacted change in his local community. And it's arguably what pushed a lot of people out of the Conservative Party and towards reform.
With reform, we now have about just over a year's worth of experience of what it's like having a council run by reform. It's not a terribly pretty picture. And I think it's interesting, if you look at one of the areas where reform underperformed in the local elections, they underperformed in the parts of London adjacent to Kent. So Kent is where reform took control of the council a year ago. They've had all sorts of problems. They've not managed to deliver on their election promises. Quite a few reform councillors have left the group in Kent. So, Kent is not your sort of star pupil if you're a reform supporter of looking at, look at what we could do. You don't want people to look at Kent. And I think there is an extent to which, therefore, people outside Kent have noticed what's happening just over the border from where they live, and that has had a negative effect. I think this is obviously one of the big questions of British politics, is that Nigel Farage's history as a party leader is that his parties frequently have always ended up quite dysfunctional, with lots of splits and chaos and confusion. He's a very skilled politician himself, but he doesn't have the skill of building an efficient and unified and effective party behind him. There are other things we could talk about that he is good at, and we may or may not be pleased that he's good at them, but building a party is not one of his strengths. And so whether reform will be able to keep the show on the road, or whether we'll all collapse in even more chaos that we'll see Kent, writ large on a national scale, TBC.
Credit where credit's due, if we have to give him credit. He's a good disruptor, and he knows how to lead the narrative. But at the minute, it does look like a good leader herding cats. I mean, you posted a list about reform councillors that have left their post, been sacked for racist comments, or left because they realised they didn't get given a key to Westminster upon being appointed a local councillor. Do you think this has undermined them a bit? Or do you think people are taking notice of this? Do you think their voter base will take notice of this? Or do you think it's a bit like, because it seems like even the the £5 million, I don't know what we want to call it, it doesn't seem to...
I think is perhaps the legally safest word, gift.
Yeah, we'll call it a gift. It hasn't been... I mean, I wonder if it's even made a dent in the polls. Do we think that, we've got a real-life example now of reform councillors that have been elected, quite literally being unable to do the job that they've been elected to do? Do you think that's going to make a blight? Do you think that anyone's taken notice of that within the reform voter base?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at reform support, they basically peaked in around the autumn of last year. And since then, we've seen their support in the national voting intention polls fall away. They're still in first place, but it has fallen since sort of September, October time last year. We've seen Nigel Farage's own personal ratings deteriorate. And we've also seen them lose a series of by-elections, most recently in Gorton and Denton, which they were absolutely going all out to win. And so we can see in both the polls and in elections some setbacks for reform in the last few months. And indeed, in these local elections we've just had earlier in May, although reform gained a lot of seats, and gain control of councils, if you look at the overall level of support and rate of gains they were making, they were not progressing as much this year as last year. So in that sense, their political popularity has definitely come off the boil. The big question, of course, is whether that trend continues, because if that trend continues for another year or so, then it's easy to see reform fall apart in all sorts of infighting and factional disagreements, given the very varied set of political views there are over things like tax or the NHS amongst reform parliamentarians and councillors and members. Or will Nigel Farage be able to pull off a little bit of his leadership magic, one might say black magic, depending on your political views, but will it turn the ship around? But I think there are definitely trends there that are not positive for reform.
How much of a threat do you think reform actually are and populist politics are to the UK?
Well, I think it is a really dangerous threat in many ways, partly because of some of the policies, and in particular the way reform basically wants to take a whole load of people who have lived in Britain for years, contributed to Britain, and kick them out of the country because they don't like them. And that, in terms of the policy substance, would be disastrous in terms of its impact on Britain. But also fundamentally, and we see this from so many of the councillors that have been in scandals in the last few months, there is a really strong strain of activity, belief further in reform that is about disliking other people. So much of what, when you hear a reform councillor in the news because they're being kicked out of the party again and again, it's because they spent so much time online expressing their dislike of other people. And I think that, I expect to disagree with people in other parties because, people will have different political views and other people will disagree with me. And that's, that's part of democracy. That's part of freedom. But having so much of your political outlook driven by who do I dislike, who do I want to kick out of the country, who do I not like, who am I going to insult, that is a real problem and is actually quite dangerous.
To ask one question on the Labour leadership race, Andy Burnham's currently trying to win a seat in Makerfield, or reform are going to throw the kitchen sink at that, right?
Yeah, and I think, credit to Andy Burnham for taking what is clearly quite a significant political gamble. Yeah, he's not playing it super safe because it's a by-election that one would normally expect Labour to lose really heavily, in that they're an unpopular government. It's an area where they've just been wiped out in the local elections. It's an area that voted very heavily Leave. It's the sort of area where you might expect reform, as you say, to think that it's got a chance. So it's by no means Andy Burnham finding a safe seat as a shoo-in to Parliament. And credit to him for being willing to take that gamble. I think what is less creditworthy is the way, though, there is a bit of the seat being seen as something that one Labour MP can pass to another as if it's their sort of private property rather than a trust that the public has vested in you. But we will see how the campaign plays out. I think one of the tricky political balancing acts Andy Burnham is going to have to carry off is that Brexit is very unpopular in Britain, but amongst Labour members whose votes Burnham needs to win, Brexit is also, even more unpopular than on average in the public. And whilst there is definitely a political space for, my own party, the Liberal Democrats, we've had some success talking up our pro-Europeanism and how we want to have closer links with the EU and so on.
Yeah.
For Andy Burnham, trying to both play to the audience in the constituency he's trying to win and also to the Labour membership in that wider mood in the country, that's going to be a very tricky line for him to navigate on Europe. It'll be interesting to see how he tries to pull that off.
It's a similar line to the one that Corbyn had to sort of toe, right? Where he, in that election with Boris Johnson, where Corbyn was not a fan of the EU and kind of didn't acknowledge it for the whole election because of the fact that, swathes of the Labour Party wanted to remain. So that is, it's quite an interesting dynamic there. The other question I've got kind of fits into that the Andy Burnham race. Alex on our other podcast asked me, do I think that the Greens will run in that race? And will there be animosity from Labour voters? Say Zach Polanski stands in that race and the Greens don't win it, Reform win it, but the Greens have obviously taken quite a lot of seats off, or quite a lot of votes off Labour in that election. Can, in a wider sense, can tactical voting stop reform?
Yeah.
Is
I
that
think there's a really nice phrase that a Green Party activist used online a while ago. And apologies, I always feel slightly guilty in quoting it because I can't remember their name, so I can't give the right person credit for it. But the phrase he used was that voters are not like Lego bricks, as in they're not just simply inanimate objects that you can reassemble and shuffle around however you want. Actually, voters get a say in that. And I think one of the things that gets in the way of just this idea that you can just neatly have this party doesn't stand and then all of its supporters will vote for that party. One is that people don't like being taken for granted like that. They don't like feeling like someone else is assuming that if I'm not going to let you do that, you're going to therefore automatically do the other. The other is that people's political views very often don't fit those neat categories quite so straightforwardly. And so, although, they aren't hugely numerous in numbers, there are Lib Dem reform swing voters, there are Green reform swing voters. And so you can't just assume that if there isn't one particular candidate, all of their votes or, the vast bulk of their votes will switch elsewhere. And that's why I think in British politics, sort of seat deals like that have a pretty patchy record. Their electoral impact, with one or two rare exceptions, is usually a bit underwhelming. Everyone ends up being a bit deflated about what the outcome was. And also they're hugely time consuming and disruptive to try to put together, which takes time and effort away from other campaigning. So we'll see what the Greens do. I saw that there has been a bit of back and forth among senior Green Party figures in sort of public or semi-public about whether they should stand or not. My guess will be there is going to be a Green candidate, but yeah, we'll see, I guess.
Yeah, because I think you're right in the sense it does kind of feel like everyone's stealing votes from each other at this point. The Lego brick analogy is quite good as well, with Lego bricks being one colour, and I don't think that's kind of quite pertinent as well. So to talk about polling briefly, polls, in your latest newsletter, you said that polling doesn't really matter when it comes to. Can you explain a little bit about that?
So it was a very specific niche in which I said polling that doesn't matter. But I think generally polling is really valuable because it tells you what people who are not like you are thinking. And so sometimes you see when somebody sees a poll result, they might comment online and say, that can't be right. No, nobody I know thinks like that. And I do sometimes respond, that's not a criticism of a poll. That is what is great about a poll. It's telling you what other people think. The other great thing about polls is they give, when they're done well and properly, an equal voice to everyone. You don't get upweighted in the poll sample and get extra importance attached to your views if you're a billionaire. You don't get extra importance if you happen to have gone to Oxford or Cambridge. You don't get extra importance because of who you have dinner with. It's a bit like, say, picking a jury. Everyone is equal in that sense. So polls in general, I think, are a really important democratic power. But I think for Labour at the moment, thinking about who should be their next leader, should they get rid of Kier Starmer, should it be Andy Burnham, should it be Wes Streeting, should it be Ed Miliband, Angela Rayner, Al Carnes, whoever. Looking at polls isn't asking the right question, because Labour's basic problem is the government is not going well. And somebody's current level of popularity matters much less, I think, than will they do the job well. So what Ed Miliband's standing with the public is, I think, matters a lot less than, has he actually done a good, competent job as a cabinet minister? And in doing that, has he shown skills that suggests he could step up to be prime minister successfully? Or Al Carnes, who it absolutely baffles me that some people in Labour are huge fans of his, think he would, he's a serious runner to be leader. Particularly, I think his recent New Statesman article was just actually really weak. But there are clearly some people who are big fans of Al Carnes. And again, I think the point is not, well, how does Al Carnes come out in the polls? It's, okay, what has he actually done as a minister that makes you think he's got the skills to step up successfully to prime minister? So for all that, I will definitely be paying lots of attention to what the polls say about all of them. What I really want to read, if I was a Labour member, what I would really want to be thinking about is, what's their record at doing things and showing leadership? Is the fall in NHS waiting lists? It's not been a massive fall, but there has been a bit of a fall under Wes Streeting. Is that down to Wes Streeting, or is that down to Rachel Reeves, finding more money for the NHS? Which of the two of them can claim policy credit for that seems to me matters much more in deciding who's the right future leader for the Labour Party than what is the exact detail in a particular Ipsos poll crossbreak about how Wes Streeting's popularity compares to that of Andy Burnham in the Northeast, say. But that's an exception. Every other topic, I'll be back to eulogising about the value of looking at polls.
On that note, then, would a Labour, with polling being historically bad at foreseeing outcomes where elections are, where the choice is different, very different, do you think that a Labour reform election would be extremely hard to predict and, extremely hard to poll for?
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic unpredictability of British politics comes from us having a political system, including especially the voting system for Westminster elections, first past the post, but also more broadly a parliamentary and a media system that is all about a contest between two parties. And all the elements of that system really struggle when you have more than two parties. And the further you get away from a two-party system, the bigger the strains of the system are. And we have now, in some ways, a 5, or in Scotland and Wales with nationalists, a 6-party system. That is a very long way away from the sort of political landscape in which first past the post can deliver the results that its fans say is are the plus points of first past the post. And in that sense, it makes the next election hugely difficult to call, because how much national support you have matters less relative to how that support is distributed around the country and between different seats than it has in the past. We saw this with my own party, the Lib Dems, at the last general election, because we really concentrated our efforts on trying to win under the existing system, under the rules in front of us. Our national vote share went up a little bit, but our number of MPs absolutely soared. And we therefore had our best result in terms of MPs for a century. And I think that it means, therefore, that the national vote share figures for any party is a much less sure guide to how well or badly they might do at the election than it has been in the past. Thankfully, we've got the MRP polls, although the MRP polls vary quite widely in their sort of their quality and their track record. But we do at least have some other source of information that gives a bit of a clue. But fundamentally, I think this is a parliament in which national vote share will be at its weakest as being a predictor of which party is going to do well or badly.
And do you subscribe to this idea? There's an article written by a guy called Tim Bale about this idea of a right block and a left block, and in the left, and you've got Lib Dems, Green, and Labour in one block, and the Conservatives and Reform in another, and that's kind of the battlegrounds, I suppose. Do you agree with that?
I think there's certainly some validity to thinking about politics in that way. I emphasise the word "some" though, because there are complications around that. There are places where you can see the Lib Dems, for example, managing to appeal to Tories as the option that can stop reform, or vice versa. There are some important exceptions. Or one of the wards relatively near where I live in London has quite a large Jewish population. And I think what we saw in the local elections there was people deciding to tactically vote Labour in order to stop the Greens. That they felt, that because of the controversy about some of the anti-Semitic comments and activities of some of the Green candidates in the news, that there was a strong anti-Green tactical vote amongst them. So there are definitely lots of important exceptions around the edges. But definitely, as Tim and particularly Jane Green and Mara Morty from the British Election Study have shown, there is much greater propensity for Green, Lib Dem and Labour voters to be willing to think of switching between each of those parties on the one hand, and then Conservative and Reform on the other. But the other thing to remember is not only are those exceptions around the fringes, but people who swap between two parties sort of count double. So where it's Lib Dems up against Tories, if we win over a vote from the Tories, that's one off their tally, but also one on our tally. So it actually makes a difference of two. And so I think searching for how you can win people over is quite important. And we see that in the size of the blocks. People measure this in different ways, but if you take the simple measure of adding Conservative and Reform vote share together in the polls on the one hand and Labour, Lib Dem and Greens on the other, you see the size of those two blocks fluctuate by a fair number of points. They definitely are both two blocks that are quite chunky in size, but there's quite a lot that goes on in the margins of people switching back and forth. And that's often going to be the difference in a parliamentary seat between winning or losing when you look at how many marginal seats there are these days.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned it there. You once, like the Lib Dems won 72 seats, with the first post system working, and clearly you targeted that. But with what we're facing now with the populist right and Reform, like, does coming third with a better set of results in 2029, is that as pertinent as it was maybe when we and I suppose off the back of that question as well, is the two-party system dead?
I think the two-party system is definitely on life support. I guess what is a bit of an open question is whether we're about to enter a multi-party world, a sort of sustained multi-party world in England and at Westminster in the way that we've already had for a while in Scotland and Wales. But, are we about to enter a sort of UK-wide, Great Britain-wide sustained multi-party world? Of course, have a multi-party world in Northern Ireland as well. Or is it that a new two-party system will emerge, which in a way is what happened in the 1920s. I think there are lots of parallels between British politics now and in the 1920s. In the 1920s, we went into it with a two-party system of Conservative and Liberal, and we came out of it with a two-party system of Conservative and Labour. So it may be that we're going through a similar transformation. But I think in terms of the Lib Dem relevance, you see in lots of places, Sussex would be a good example this year of where, I think the Lib Dems gained seats, Reform gained seats. Lib Dems perhaps particularly gained votes from former Labour and Green supporters rather than winning over, say, Reform voters. But the politics of the county is now very much Reform versus Lib Dem. And if you want to stop Reform in Sussex and in many other bits of the country, the Lib Dems are the option to go for. And so I think, although, as you say, being a third party on, maybe 100 seats, say, just to pick a round number out of thin air, perhaps matters a bit less now than it would have in the past. There is a sense in which that Reform versus Lib Dem dynamic makes the Lib Dems extremely, extremely relevant. And we saw it a lot in council by-elections over the last year, that where Reform were in the top two, the other party most likely to be in the top two was Lib Dem. So the most common option for stopping Reform was Lib Dem. And if we see that trend continue and spread more widely, then maybe we'll come out of this with a different two-party system rather than a multi-party system. But all sorts of other factors may intrude, such as, do we end up with Andy Burnham as Prime Minister, and does he remember his pro-electoral reform previous rhetoric, and do we end up with a new voting system, which of course would change the fundamental dynamics completely? From the point of view of an outsider to the Labour Party, which I am, it seems to me Labour has this really frustrating tradition of being really keen on thinking about electoral reform right up until the moment when it might be able to do something about it, and then tends to back away. There have been periods in opposition where Labour has got very keen on electoral reform, but then has sort of backed away when it's come to the crunch of actually maybe here's now a moment where we can do something. Andy Burnham's conversion to electoral reform seems to have come relatively late in his political career. Electoral reformers in Labour who I know are pretty optimistic that it's a genuine conversion and that he really means it, and that he will, if he ends up Prime Minister, therefore may follow through on it. I've sort of seen too many other Labour figures sort of in the end back away. That's maybe made me I'm not sure if it's cynical or wise. I guess which way Andy Burnham goes will depend which way you view that. So I think electoral reformers across the political spectrum should do our best to encourage people like Andy Burnham to continue to believe in electoral reform, and let's see what plays out.
I've got two questions left. One of them I am going to ask you for a prediction, so prepare yourself for that.
Yeah.
But the first one is so there's the populist right are very good at getting attention, and with social media playing a bigger part in how we form our political opinions and how we receive our news and information. Do you think the Lib Dems are doing enough to get attention in this attention economy? And I suppose it's not just the Lib Dems really. It's also, you could level that criticism at basically all the parties, apart from maybe Green and Reform, who are both quite good at getting attention.
Well, this is absolutely a major part of why Ed Davey slides down so many water slides, falls into so many lakes, spins around on so many teacup rides at fun fairs and so on, because you're right, you need to grab people's attention in a fun and engaging way to then have the chance of getting a political message over to them as well. And I think if you look at what Ed did in the general election, but how that's been sustained, so he is consistently comes out top on the ratings of all the party leaders. He has the best favourability ratings, net favourability ratings, that is, that I think that has worked very well and is continuing to work. I think the challenge is that the media landscape for how people find news about politics is very complicated, and although it has undoubtedly changed massively, in some respects, it's not changed as much as people think it has. In that, if you look at which medium people get their news from, and you look at how the numbers have really dropped for printed newspapers and really taken off for, say, TikTok, you think, wow, this is a completely different world. However, what's also the case is if you ask the question slightly differently, you see how the BBC is still a really dominant source of political news for people. Now, you might be getting your BBC News via watching a reel on Instagram rather than watching the evening TV bulletin on linear broadcast, but it's still the BBC. And the big challenge that, we in the Lib Dems face is the BBC is very driven by quite traditional metrics as to, who it thinks it's important, who it's going to give attention to. And so we're always struggling up against that sort of that classic BBC and broadcaster more widely mindset. But yeah, definitely that's something we, and I'm sure people in other parties as well, need to keep on thinking about, focusing on working out how to do. And I think this comes back to what we'd said earlier about Kier Starmer. I think one of the reasons Labour has struggled so much is in such a complicated media landscape, you need to have some really simple, clear messages that you keep on banging away at, and that you have your clear and consistent priority if you're in government, to have some chance of those cutting through. And instead, the Labour government under Kier Starmer has been a bit all over them.
I lied. I've got one more question before my prediction question. Lib Dems, to stopping reform, what role do Lib Dems have to play, and what do they need to do to play that role?
Well, I think you've seen it in the council elections, in particular, in large parts of England just earlier this month, that in lots of places, the local electoral battleground is becoming Lib Dem versus Reform. And so what we need to do is both succeed in those places and spread our strength more broadly. But you are again and again seeing the local political situation becoming Reform versus Lib Dem, and that we're the power, therefore, to stop Reform. And I gave an example from Southern England earlier, give an example from Northern England. You look in, say, Sunderland, where traditionally very much a Labour city, but the politics of that city is becoming a Reform versus Lib Dem contest, and so you see it all across the country. I think the other thing that is important, and which Ed Davey in particular has been much more willing to do than either Kemi Badenoch or Kier Starmer, is standing up to populism more broadly. Ed Davey is rightly much more critical of Nigel Farage's dalliances with Donald Trump and what Donald Trump and the Trump administration are trying to do. And I think that is, given how much international issues affect our day-to-day lives in the UK, I think that's an important part of politics as well.
Also, it feels like nowadays international politics are also kind of, they polarize more, and they seem to set people's opinions on domestic politics in a way.
Yeah, and I think that's partly because there's a very clear connection between what is Donald Trump doing in Iran and how much is your next grocery bill going to be. That those two are connected in a way that, for all that there was huge levels of public interest and concern and protest over, say, George W. Bush's Middle Eastern policies, that you didn't quite have that same connection to people's day-to-day lives in the way that we see at the moment. The other is that the rise of social media means that people can often feel a much more direct connection and see much more easily of the stories of what's happening in other parts of the world. And that's very good in many ways in terms of, say, holding dictators to account and so on. There's some real positives about it. But it also means, as you say, that those what would have been the foreign news in the past is in your Instagram feed just as much as what would have been called domestic news, and it's all part of the same.
Just wanted to ask that question again, because I know that you kind of covered it when you spoke about the Sussex, but I thought there was a bit more there to just sort of get into, and your sort of point about Ed Davey, criticising Farage and criticising Trump, I think sort of does that. It shows why the Lib Dems are being seen as an alternative. So yeah, my last question, as I promised, is a prediction question. Where do you think the Labour leadership will go, and what impact do you think that will have on the next general election potentially? Where do you think?
That is a tough prediction, because I think Andy Burnham, if he gets elected as an MP, is in a very strong position to win the Labour leadership. But there are two things that make a prediction really hard. One is it's probably a toss-up as to whether or not he will win the by-election, which, as I said, in a way is to his credit. He's putting his political career and his credibility on the line in that way. Only someone who is foolish would say with utter certainty they know what the outcome of the by-election would be, and they probably have their fingers crossed that there's a 50-50 chance, therefore, either of their comment being forgotten or of them being able to say for the rest of their lives, look, I was absolutely right. But, that is a really hard one to call. The other is, and this is one of the really, I think, frustrating and unfortunate elements of democracy, is what leadership candidates say during a leadership election is not always a terribly good guide to what they will be like subsequently. And we saw that particularly with Kier Starmer. And the sorts of things he was saying in the last Labour leadership election, because he was pitching for the votes of Labour members. But also, in terms of actually that Labour leadership election didn't bring to light some of those fundamental leadership failures that we've now seen exposed for Starmer. So I think knowing what direction the next leader of the Labour Party, whoever it is, I guess there's a tiny chance Starmer might somehow hang on through all of this chaos all around him, but most likely somebody other than Starmer. I think it's quite hard to call at this point. But I think what should make everyone optimistic is that fundamentally we all need a government that is in some way doing well. If you're in an opposition party, there's always a little bit of guilty pleasure about government failing, because then you can campaign more easily against it. But fundamentally, people are living their day-to-day lives under whoever the current government is. And so we do all want and need that government to be working well, etc. And I think some of the things that Starmer has got wrong are so basic that it should be possible for a new Prime Minister to do rather better. They'll still face all sorts of very difficult challenges, but they should at least be able to start doing things like understanding that having a coherent plan across government is a good idea and will help make things better.
So I think that's a good place to end the discussion. And yeah, thanks for joining us. Obviously, you have your own Substack and your own podcast. Could you want to just tell people a little bit about that as well before we go?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Harry. If hearing me on this podcast hasn't put you off, but you want more, I do a weekly email newsletter about the opinion polls called The Week in Polls. And amongst my various other bits, I have a new podcast with Corey Hazelhurst called Political Fictions, where every 2 weeks we review whether it's a film or a TV drama or a novel about politics. So we've covered things like the famous film about Watergate, All the President's Men, or the recent Borgen episode about Greenland. So Political Fictions is the podcast, and The Week in Polls is the polling email newsletter.
Thanks again for joining us. And I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Harry. It's been a lovely conversation.